Chapter 2 The Cross and the Sickle. On the flight from Leningrad to Kiev, I thumbed through a batch of news clippings sent by a friend in the States. Among them was the story of a U.S. Air Force pilot who had survived 54 days in the remote Sierras after his jet exploded. The pilot was quoted, "My firm belief in God kept me going. I prayed so much, I don't think I'll ever stop praying." I turned from the clipping to look down on the gigantic panorama of Russian space, the country and the people to whom Lenin said, "Our struggle is to eliminate the social roots of religion." A village below me was teeming with people. It passed, and we flew over land sparsely settled. Far in the distance was a cluster of buildings representing a collective farm. Now a war-torn settlement appeared with gaunt smokestacks, defying the ruins, and miles of road without a car or sign of life. Then a huge, barren carpet of land, wasteland, and steppes, as if waiting for some great decision. Russia, endlessly big, 3 times the size of the United States, had a big assignment: eliminate the social roots of religion. A hand touched my arm. It was the very engaging and very bald-headed Russian who sat across from me in the plane, holding a very bald-headed youngster on his lap. Actually, their heads were shaven down to the skin they had gotten on at Minsk. The moment Lorena saw them, she was fascinated by the picture possibilities and by the tremendous affection between the two. They were both charmers, and they knew it. Earlier, I had given the boy a stick of gum. Now the father was inquiring of me, by means of gestures, what it was for. He had been studying the wrapper and turning the gum over in his hands. I demonstrated that it should be chewed. The boy wanted to try it, but the father was not so sure. On an airplane where chiclets are unheard of and in a country where gum is practically unknown, Wrigley's was an oddity. The stewardess, whose English was as bad as my Russian, and whose uniform was as out of press as my traveling suit, shuddered and said, "It is bad on teeth. It is not polite." She repeated this for the shaven-headed man. He laughed and agreed. The stewardess noticed the American clippings on my lap and caught sight of the picture of the jet and the Air Force pilot. She picked up the clipping, read it laboriously, and at length smiled, shook her head, and handed it back. For most Americans, the pilot's story was just another saga of faith to be added to a continually growing list. His resort to religion was characteristic of a deeply inbred tendency in most of us in the United States. We were always turning to religion. Accounts of the power of prayer appeared frequently in our newspapers and magazines. We were always pulling on the side of faith, but this was Russia. Below me lay the land and rivers of a nation whose leaders knew no God, felt no need for God, and hoped their people would eliminate the search for Him. There was a time in the days of the Tsars when 90% of the Russian people belonged to a church, but say the communists. The people never got anywhere then. They never shared in the land or in industry. They were never permitted to raise their heads, or speak their minds or think. Liberation, says the party, came not by faith in religion, but by faith in revolution. Only when the Bolsheviks broke the czars and the church did God let his people go. Now we were flying over wooded hills and winding valleys. Then a group of whitewashed homes and a collective farm passed beneath the wing of our two-motored plane. Soon we caught sight of the Dnieper, one of the most beautiful rivers in all of Russia, and beside it the lovely city of Kiev, capital of the Ukraine. Church domes rose upward among the tree-shaded streets, and cathedral walls could be clearly seen. Kiev, I had been told, is the Jerusalem of Russia. It was here that Christianity in Russia began. We headed for the landing field. I searched for my seat belt, then remembered there wasn't any. There was part of one where Lorena sat next to me, so she added it to the strap of her gadget bag and hung on. We came barnstorming down, the pilot electing to land next to the runway on the ground rather than on the blacktop strip. Russian pilots never failed to give us a thrill, and landings were generally unannounced. We were learning early in our trip that Soviet flying is safe, but full of surprises. From the very start of our 3-day stay in Kiev, everything was pleasant. The weather was considerably warmer and brighter than in Leningrad. The people were more colorfully dressed, their life noticeably easier and more relaxed. Kiev had a good, free feeling. Even the pigeons flew in and out of the unscreened windows in our 4th-floor room at the In-Tourist Hotel. In-Tourist guides continued to serve our needs and answer our request, and extend us all the liberty we wished. So much so that by now I had written off the complaints of friends back home who said they had been in-tourist captives during their Russian trips. These friends, however, had traveled in the USSR during the days of Stalin. Restrictions then were undoubtedly severe, and the secret police apparently did make themselves offensive. The de-Stalinization was good for Russia, and come to think of it, so far I had not seen a single Stalin statue anywhere along the way. There was, however, one statue that fascinated me, the huge bronze figure of a man with a cross looming like a colossus high above the Dnieper. 100 years ago, this gigantic 62-foot image was placed upon its pedestal, and today it still looks down upon the river as its undisputed conqueror. This is Prince Vladimir, monarch of Russia, from 980 to 1015, a ruler so absolute that he divided his kingdom among his 12 sons. Originally, he was called Vladimir the Pagan. To gain the throne, he killed his brother Yarpolok, who had killed another brother, Oleg, before him. Vladimir celebrated his ascent to the throne by murdering a number of servants and killing a number of horses as an offering to Svorog, the Slavic god of gods. But shortly after his notorious sacrifice, Vladimir suddenly tired of killing and looked around for a religion which did not demand the shedding of blood. It is said he sent his emissaries to many parts of the world to investigate the religions men lived by. They gave him a report on Islam and wondered whether that might appeal to him. It did not, because Islam forbade its subjects to drink. Then they explained the influence and belief of Judaism. He rejected this because it opposed the eating of pork. So the emissaries told Vladimir about Christianity, and he found nothing in the faith to conflict with his new way of life, or interfere too much with his change of heart. Furthermore, he liked Christianity because it was flourishing in Byzantium, the greatest power in the East. Vladimir's informers, in their appraisal of Byzantine Christianity, reported, "We went to Greece, and the Greeks led us to the edifices where they worship their God. When we arrived there, we knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth. Never have we seen such splendor and beauty. We are at a loss to describe it. God dwells there among men, and the services of the Greeks are fairer than the ceremonies of any other nation." Vladimir was also advised that in the Byzantine Empire, the emperors dominated the church, and the church dominated the people. It was different in Rome, where Western Christianity was flourishing. In Rome, Pope Gregory VII insisted that the Pope was mightier than the emperor, that the Pope was, in fact, appointed by God in an unbroken succession of popes from the time of Peter. Hence, of the two institutionalized expressions of Christianity, Byzantine or Roman, Vladimir much preferred the former. He ordered his subjects to be baptized, some by persuasion, others by coercion. He issued proclamations, "There will be baptism in the river. Those who do not come will incur my displeasure." He demonstrated his good intentions by destroying the image of Svarog, the god of gods, and Puran, the god of thunder, and Vales, the god of cattle, and all the other Slavic gods and Norse deities. He replaced them with icons bearing the gentle face of the Virgin and the grieving, thorn-crowned man from Galilee. There had been pre-Vladimir attempts to bring Christianity to Russia. St. Andrew, the brother of Peter, preached, it is said, on the shores of the Dnieper shortly after the death of Christ. In 950, Princess Olga of the Russian aristocracy was baptized at Byzantium and founded a church at Kiev. The apostles to the Slavs, Cyril and Methodius, preached in nearby Moravia as early as 850, invented a Slavonic alphabet, and translated the Bible, but it remained for Vladimir the Pagan to make the faith official, to assign it to his subjects, and to use it as an instrument of domination. It is Vladimir who stands on the hill, and it is Vladimir the Christian whose hand clutches the shimmering cross. And that is how Christianity officially became the holiest religion of the Rus. The contract between the coming of Christianity to Russia and the coming of the faith to America was sharp and clear, as I talked with my Ukrainian guide near the statue. When I went to school, I was taught that the early settlers came to our shores with the Word of God in their hands and the fear of God in their hearts. I was assured that the first act was prayer, their first meeting one of thanksgiving, their first service Holy Communion, stamped On my mind were faith's milestones, the pilgrims trudging to church, a communion service at Jamestown, Washington, praying at Valley Forge. American religion, I was told, was glorious, interwoven with American history, and I felt we had done our Christian best, even by the Redskins. I was always proud of every historic mention of religion. USA. When my Kiev guide, who was 33, went to school, he learned about religion. USSR. He was taught that the story of St. Andrew was fiction. He was warned that Princess Olga was a cunning witch, made worse, not better, by the Christian faith. He was taught that she accepted gifts of pigeons from her enemies, then tied firebrands to the pigeons' feet and let them fly back to burn up the towns. Cyril and Methodius were presented to him as good scholars, but bad agents of a foreign power. As for Prince Vladimir, he became a Christian because of political advantage. Historic truth assured my guide that Vladimir's 12 sons were the offspring of various wives, and the chronicles clearly stated that one of the sons, who became ruler only after much intrigue and fratricide, appointed and installed the first Russian-born metropolitan of the Russian Church. Obviously, my guide's milestones of faith were startling. Unlike mine, history had given me something to live up to in the lives of America's men and the tradition of American events. Religion for me was the force that kept people free, that guided people right, that led people forward and upward in their dreams of a homeland and a nation. Religion for my Russian guide, and millions like him, was a conspiracy between czars and patriarchs at the expense of the people, plotting between church and state, in which the people were exploited, schemes among religionists, and foreign powers in which the people were usually destroyed. Young Russia knew religion as an evil. We Americans saw it as a blessing. They saw it as a weapon in the hands of the powerful. We thought of it as an element of restraint. They called it a rod in the hands of the rich, and a whip in the hands of the priest. Small wonder that my guide concluded, "If this is religion, let us have none of it. If this is God, give me none of him." So I, with my trust in religion, and my guide, with his distrust for it, decided to hold to our own impressions, which we did, and we walked away together, leaving Vladimir standing on the hill to brood over the Dnieper. We left him there in the blazing sun to ponder, if he wished, what chance his ancient cross might have against the modern hammer and sickle. What chance does it have? Just now my answer was, none, for we were entering the torn and battered grounds of the Kiev Petrskaya monastery. War and time and the abandonment of religion had here worked together to turn one of Russia's holiest places into desolation. The Kiev Petrskaya Lavra, as it is called, has the excellent situation of a fortress over the Dnieper Valley. Once the monks were trained here to kill those who tried to invade the land. The czars taught the monks how to fight. The monks taught the czars how to pray. But Petrskaya Monastery was first and foremost a place for spiritual retreat. Here stood the great cathedral of St. Sophia. Here St. Hilarion lived as a hermit, and a certain St. Anthony lived a life so pious that it changed the hearts of the peasantry. Here St. Theodosius demonstrated the meaning of Christian austerity, and here the great St. Nestor lived and died. Once it was the spiritual center of Russian Orthodoxy, foremost among 1,800 monasteries which honeycombed the land. Today there are less than 50. Petcherskaya already seems more like a museum than a place for prayer. A bearded monk poked aimlessly among the crushed and powdered stones of what was once a chapel. He stopped and looked up. High above him, the vivid gold and red blaze of a fresco shimmered on a tottering wall. Once it was the hallowed interior of a great cathedral. Now it stands alone among the tangled mass of sacred rubbish. Petcherskaya tugged at my heart. I saw what the monk saw, a fragment of the past without any plan or hope for restoration. The communists want the wall to remain, want it to stand as it is, as long as it will. It is a symbol of what the German Luftwaffe wrought in one inexorable night. They left a campanile standing, also part of a chapel, part of St. Sophia, and the frescoed wall, actually the work of 100 years, and the labor of 10,000 hands, were turned to ruin and desolation between the hours of dusk and dawn. An elderly French artisan sat in an improvised shack, painstakingly restoring an ancient painting. He had his questions. Where are the children of the men who created these murals? Where are the sons of the artist who made these icons? Where are the descendants of the architects who planned these walls and cupolas? No matter what the church may have been in the past, no matter how corrupt its leaders, the artists were inspired. They were in love with God. They are gone now, all gone. They are no longer exist, and they are not being reborn. Modern men know only the art of destruction, in that all men and all nations excel. There are catacombs at Petcherskaya, and as is the case everywhere in the world, there are guided tours. I paid a modest fee, was handed a candle, and joined a small, expectant group which had gathered out of nowhere. Our guide for the underground excursion was a young post-revolutionist Russian who had long ago decisively settled the argument between the cross and the sickle. To him this assignment was more than a tourist attraction. It was an opportunity to expose the heresies of the faith which once ruled Petcherskaya, and a chance to get in a few good licks for communism's appraisal of religion. He could speak 5 languages: Russian, Ukrainian, English, German, and French. Our first descent, some 10 steps down, took us past an aging hooded monk, standing immobile as a mummy, holding a lighted taper clenched in both hands. The flicker of light struck his heavily bearded face. It touched his eyes, disclosing searchless wonder at the sight of people entering the sacred tunnels, laughing and talking of spooks. He had probably seen and heard this many times, days on end, but he still found it amazing. He stood there, his brown habit blending into the damp niche, It was as though some strategist had set him thus, impaled him there for all to see how futile is God's cause, how weird and warped is custom, how out of date the simple-minded follower of Christ. It was as if someone had vengefully set him there, and ordered, "Hold the candle until we tell you to let it go, stupid brother. Hold it there, that all may see the last faint flicker of your dying faith." The passageways are 6 feet high. They have been grubbed out of the earth, dug out of the rock, and then smoothed over with layers of thick, dark clay. They are so narrow we had to always walk single file. Every few steps brought us to a crypt where coffins hold the shrouded bodies of the ancient Ch2-3 brotherhood. Our candles permitted us to see the blackened hands and shriveled skulls beneath the glass-covered caskets. Then our guide explained, in several languages, how absurd it was for men to live and die in these self-appointed dungeons. Some people like to think, he announced, that these bodies are miraculously preserved. Well, you can see for yourself. They are just like any other dead bodies. When the monastery became the property of the people, it was discovered there were quite a number of women buried, along with the men. Since no women were supposed to have been allowed in Petrskaya, you figured this out for yourself. He resumed his march as though his words were gospel of a sort, but suddenly a Midwestern feminine voice from our group spoke up. "Oh, just a moment now," it said indignantly. "The sisters could have been buried here out of respect. It doesn't follow that these people were immoral just because you think they were." We stopped in our tracks at this unrehearsed inclusion in our tour. For a moment the tunnels were as silent as their dead. I lifted my candle to get a better look at the challenger. So did our guide. He turned as if to ask, "Who said that?" But before he had a chance to speak, the resourceful American voice went on, "I don't mean to say you haven't a right to your opinion. I just don't happen to agree with you." She looked at him calmly, somewhat shyly, but her voice had been sharp, just the same. Sharp, with a kind of petulance. She was in her 30s, a quiet-appearing, self-sufficient, pretty woman, with a shoulder-strap purse and a camera, and carrying her candle between her first and second fingers, palm up, just as we had been instructed to do. She had a print handkerchief tied around her auburn hair, a head covering quickly put on for going to church. "If you look at these things with suspicion," she was saying, "you can read all sorts of meanings into them." "Very well," replied the guide, in full recovery. "As I said, every person can figure out for himself, and believe what seems right to him. So now, watch your step. Here we go down into another section." We went down, judge and jury, and the woman who had spoken in defense of the dead. Our guide hurried us past a ghetto in which an old woman knelt, with forehead touching the cobblestone floor. Around her huddled a small group of worshippers, mumbling prayers and making the sign of the cross against their dark-clothed bodies. The guide paused at a sarcophagus. He held his candle close to a picture above it and said, "Now here is a portrait of the fellow who lies here. You see he is supposed to be a saint. Men become saints for many reasons. Most of the reasons are rather strange, like seeing visions or performing magic, or fasting until they no longer cared to eat, or perhaps collecting more money than was expected of them. For in those days the church was very remunerative business. This poor fellow was made a saint for a different reason. He was sainted because he never spoke. You can see it written right here. He kept forever silent, so he is a saint. He smiled and waited, candle in hand, to see whether anyone would care to challenge him. Someone did. "I just don't think you're fair," said our defender of the faith. "Either you don't want to be fair, or you know nothing about religious practices. This man wasn't a saint because he kept silent. He kept silent because he was a saint. You simply don't understand the life of religious people." "I understand what it says here," retorted the guide. "It says he kept forever silent. There is his picture. There he lies, dead, but he is a saint. Do you know how powerful religion is? Just about as powerful as that little candle you're carrying." "He led us on," the girl said to me. "It really isn't fair. He shouldn't say those things. They aren't true. It isn't only what he says, it's the way he says it." She was Roman Catholic, and she loved her church with such a passion she had love to spare for the Russian Orthodox and the whole Eastern Rite, which, she reminded me, broke away from the Mother Church in 1058. She was sorry about that. The breaking away, the great schism, had divided the Christian family, but Rome was absolutely in the right, she was sure. The separation of Christianity between East and West was due to more than just a cultural difference. The Eastern Church permitted itself to be dominated by the emperors and the czars. It also refused to recognize the primacy of the Pope. It objected to the Filioque clause, which stated that the Holy Spirit descended not only from God the Father, but from the Son as well. The East, she maintained, had always been more concerned with theological argumentation than with living the Christian life. But despite her historical criticism, or because of it, she was mindful of the Russian saints, and had a deep conviction that someday, soon, the whole Russian Church would return to Roman Catholicism. She was always praying for the salvation of Russia. Everyone in the Mother Church was praying for that. When we stood before the picture of Saint Nestor, which adorned a dark corner in the catacombs, she inquired of the guide, "What do you think of him? Wasn't he one of Russia's greatest saints?" "Correction, please," was the reply. "Nestor was one of our great chroniclers. That is admitted, but we must always be careful to separate history from mythology. We must differentiate between the qualities a man holds in one field and those he professes in another. Consider Tolstoy. Tolstoy was an able writer, but that is not to say he was a good philosopher." At this moment, singing was heard, choral singing, enhanced by the dark, reverberating catacomb setting. It was evidently coming from the ghetto where the women had been at worship. We paused instinctively and listened. Our Catholic spokesman, who in our minds had become quite an advocate for faith's cause, stood near me. Her eyes were ecstatic, as if heaven had suddenly sprung to her defense. "Well, come," commanded the guide. "We must be on our way. Our candles are burning out." He led us on, past icons, coffins, and shrines, past rectangular chambers in which an occasional worshipper knelt and prayed. Nevertheless, we could not outdistance the singing. It echoed through the cloistered passages and trailed us until we reached the out of doors. The guide was wrong about the candles. We had light to spare. The Catholic woman was a school teacher from Nebraska whose convictions had been forged through years of study in a convent. She confided to me she had come to Russia to find out what was happening to religion, particularly Roman Catholic religion. Several weeks of unhindered inquiry had convinced her that the churches are indeed open in the USSR, and that Christianity has a chance to grow if the people want it to grow. Her feeling was that Russians are deeply religious, but that the shock of persecution and early post-revolution opposition have made the masses hesitant to affirm their faith even now. She had discovered many small devout Roman Catholic congregations, had worshipped with them, and had talked to the priest. Her major interest now was in locating Uniate congregations. She felt Uniatism might be the answer to controversies that still existed between Catholicism and Orthodoxy. Unist is the name applied to Christians who are in union with both the Russian and Roman churches. They retain the liturgy and forms of orthodoxy, but acknowledge the primacy of the Pope and the Roman Catholic articles of faith. She was sure that somewhere in communist Russia the Uniates were worshipping, even though many had been liquidated during the war as accused propagandists for Poland. "God's true people will always rise again," she declared prophetically, and repeated her conviction that the Eastern Orthodox prodigals would one day return to their spiritual home in the West. Now, of course, Eastern Orthodox churches do not think of themselves as prodigals. They are solemnly convinced that their church, and not the Church of Rome, is the true church. They believe their patriarchs to be the direct spiritual descendants of St. Peter, their liturgy to be God-inspired, and their creeds and codes to be infallibly divine. Furthermore, it is the Russian Orthodox Church which accuses Rome of all sorts of heterodoxies. It lists among the Latin errors such things as baptizing by sprinkling instead of immersion, of advocating celibacy for the priesthood, of putting too much stress and fear into the teaching of purgatory, and too much emphasis on the primacy of the Pope, to say nothing about the heresy of eating eggs and cheese during Lent. Then there is also the Russian contention that Rome is in league with imperialism and an agent of capitalistic power. We find many admirable things about Roman Catholicism, a Russian Orthodox official said to me, but the true church is not in the West, but in the East. When Christ comes again, he will come first, not to Rome or New York or even Istanbul, but to Moscow. It has well been said, the Church of ancient Rome fell because of Apollinarian heresy. The second Rome, Constantinople, was hewn down by the axes of the Ishmaelites. But the third Rome, Moscow, the Holy Apostolic Church, shines through the entire world more brightly than the sun. Two Romes have fallen, but the third stands, and no fourth can ever be. I was sure he meant it, although it was becoming ever more difficult to break through what I felt was apprehension and restraint on the part of the clergy to share their true feelings about Russian religion. The weight of their opinion was always complimentary to the state. Never would they criticize the party. Never would they challenge governmental policies. To say the least, the Russian religious scene was deceptive. True, churches were open, but churches were also closed. Freedom of religion was a reality. The Constitution provided it, but it also provided freedom to disseminate anti-religious propaganda. It was quite correct to say there was a separation of church and state, but the state owned the church properties, and Communist Party members were not allowed to belong to a religious organization. Teaching of religion was permitted, but it was also strictly limited. No religious teaching was allowed in the case of children under 18 in groups of more than 3. It was true that the people were free to avail themselves of the church's ceremonies, but informed atheism had grown so powerful psychologically that many worshippers were shamed into staying away from the church. For example, marriages, says communist law, must be solemnized by the state and may be solemnized in the church. Actually, only 10% of marriages in Russia today are officiated over by a clergyman. Anyone in Russia can find a place to worship if he looks for it, I was told, but 80% of the people had been persuaded not to look. To pursue these matters further, I returned one evening to Pecherskaya Monastery to see what a center of Russian Orthodoxy would be like at Vesper time, to try to find out for myself whether or not a spiritual night had fallen over it, and to visit, if possible, the monks' living quarters and speak with some of the men. Unable to secure an interpreter, I persuaded a friendly taxi driver to take me out to the grounds. At first, he hesitated. I offered to tip him. This offended him, so he decided to take me to prove that his reluctance had absolutely nothing to do with a tip. Pecherskaya Lavra was deserted when we arrived, but at the ghostly entrance to the catacombs, a bearded, brown-cowled monk stood with hands hidden in his sleeves. I made myself understood sufficiently for him to lead me to a side gate which led to the monastery proper. Then he misunderstood me and left me standing there. I walked to the rear entrance and proceeded down a darkening corridor which led to the sleeping quarters. I thought that was where it led, but I was stopped by a gentle, muffled voice questioning in soft, sing-song Ukrainian tones. "Where are you going, brother? Where are you going?" The words were repeated over and over, but I saw no one. Then after a moment I spied an aged monk seated in a dark corner on a bench. His hands rested on a walking stick. He rocked slowly back and forth and asked, "Where are you going, brother?" His forehead was nestled on his hands, and I could not see his face. I tried to ask in Russian, "Where do I find the abbot?" He did not look up. I asked the question in English, taking a few steps in his direction. He raised his head. His beard was closely cropped. His heavy hair was as dark as the corner in which he sat, and his eyes were blind. His face was one of the most serene and gentle I've ever seen. He was smiling, and it was a look of extreme compassion and simple questioning. Turning slightly in my direction, he asked again, "Where are you going, brother? Where are you going?" The expression on his face was one of quiet triumph, as if to say, "I could tell by the sound of your steps that you are not one of us. You are a stranger, I know. Do not think that because I am blind I cannot see." Since there was nothing I could say or do, I walked away, but I felt I would never forget the blind gatekeeper at Ch2-3. The question he asked me was the question I wanted to ask Russia. "Where are you going?" For it seemed to me that the sound of its steps was different from that of any nation in the world. How or why, I could not tell, unless I related it to my estimate of religion's meaning in the life of man. A vague contrast between people who believe in God and those who do not struck me forcibly as I turned from the blind and gentle monk. The contrast had to do with the supreme worth of the soul, or at any rate the supreme worth of the individual. Communism, it seemed to me, lacked not only the comprehension or even the good guess about the nature of God, it even lacked a comprehension and a guess about the true nature of man. There is, I told myself, definitely a difference between those who live by the hammer and sickle and those who live by the cross. Even a blind man in the dark knows that. My taxi driver had come to look for me. He was not worried, but he wanted to remind me there was a charge for waiting. He did not mind waiting either. He just wanted to advise me so that we would understand each other when it came time to settle up. I assured him this was kind of him and asked if he would go to the chapel with me. He smiled and shook his head. Did I know where the chapel was? It was over there, where several beggars sat hopelessly in the dirt outside the door, but beyond them in the dusky interior. White-scarved women stood with folded hands facing the censer-swinging priest. A group of bearded monks were crowded into a choir stall in the left transept. Other monks stood in prayer stalls at the right. The congregation consisted of perhaps 100 peasant women, a half a dozen men, and a few youths. The gold-covered iconostasis extended from floor to ceiling, and in the dimly candle-lighted room the ancient colors sent out shafts of light. The rising smoke from the silver censers, the continually bowing worshippers, formed the setting for a lengthy scripture reading intoned in the old Slavonic language by a bearded monk. I understood not a word of it, but it was interesting to conjecture that words like these had been recited here uninterruptedly for nearly 1,000 years. Ch2-3 Lavra has seen the invasion and plunder of more than 20 years. The monastery was used as a fortress during the Mongol and Tartar invasions. The catacombs were air raid shelters during World War II. Hitler gave the Nazis orders to subvert the Orthodox churches or destroy them. He had already set up a school in Breslau to train men to take over the Russian church after the Nazis conquered the land. They never conquered it. They never stilled the chanting at Pecherskaya, chanting unbelievably beautiful, which I was hearing now. No outside power had ever defeated the church. Could the communistic power within Russia defeat it? I listened to the chanting, and I seemed to hear the priest say to me again, "The future of the church is up to the people." I remembered how Christians in America had thrilled when, at the height of the Nazi invasion of Russia, Patriarch Sergius of the Russian Orthodox faith said to Hitler, "You have deprived your people of the freedom of religion against their will. You can never do it to us. The Church of Christ gives its blessing to our Orthodox people. The Lord will grant us victory." In those days, we in the United States were praying for victory, along with the Russian people. England was praying, the Buddhists were praying, the Jews and the Muslims were praying. In those days, a bishop of the Armenian Church said in a sermon, "It is 1,000,000 times happier and more desirable to live in a godless land of Soviets than in the nest of those venomous snakes and cannibals. The fascism is an evil spirit, and Hitler will not find absolution either on earth or in heaven. Cursed be the cannibal. May God punish the viper in the fires of hell." As I thought of this, the struggle between the cross and the hammer and sickle became ever more confusing. For by now, perhaps, God had punished Hitler, and the fires of hell had punished him. By now, England and the Buddhists and the Jews and the Muslims were no longer praying for Russia, and we were not praying for Russia, with the exception, perhaps, of the Blue Army of Roman Catholicism. And where is the Russian Church that helped win the war? The church that Patriarch Sergius talked about? Is it to be found in 100 white-scarved women and a dozen bearded men in Russia's famous monastery at Pecherskaya in Kiev? I wondered myself that this should be religious research and not religious sentimentality. I looked at the iconostas and asked myself the question the old French artisan asked, "Where are the children of these men?" I closed my eyes and listened to the chanting. I wished that every Protestant and every Catholic and every person, no matter what he is or whether he is anything at all, could hear it. I said to myself, perhaps true religion is something no one even talks about. Maybe it is, like music and love and beauty, and that is all there is to it. And I thought what a much better place the world would be if everyone just loved God and never even spoke about him to anyone, just loved him and spoke to him and let it go at that. The service continued, and the people crossed themselves and bowed whenever they heard the words, "Lord, have mercy." When it was over, and I started in the direction of the cab, I met a man who spoke German and French, and Ukrainian and Russian. He was a Russian officer, and he happened to be in Kiev, and he happened to be at the monastery, And there were 3 monks who tarried in the cloistered walk, and through the kindness of the officer interpreter, I asked them, "How strong is the church in Russia?" One replied, "You cannot measure spiritual strength." "How many churches are there?" "Thousands of churches. There are churches everywhere." "Do you enjoy complete freedom of worship?" I asked. "Of course. Why not?" "How many monks are here?" "About 100. "Are there any young men?" "There are some." "How many?" "Perhaps 10 or 20. "What do you feel you are accomplishing?" "We are God's servants. We are doing His will." "Does God's will ever conflict with the will of the state?" I asked. "The state is atheistic. It does not recognize God. Isn't this a conflict with your belief?" "The Scripture commands the Church to recognize and obey the secular powers. That is our view. So you are subservient to the state." "No, there is a separation of church and state." "Say that Russia engages in war. Would you sanction it, even if it were an aggressive war?" "Russia has never been guilty of an aggressive war. It does not want war, it wants peace. If Russia should be invaded, would you fight?" "Of course, even if the invaders were Christians." "We would. I do not understand how a Christian could consent to be an invader." "Are Russian people particularly religious?" "Russian people have always been religious." "Do you think your leaders are spiritual people?" "It is not for us to judge who is spiritual and who is not. They do not judge me. We do not judge them. They are spiritually minded." "Which will triumph in Russia, the cross or the hammer and sickle?" "Is there a conflict?" I was asked. "Of course there is a conflict. Lenin said the search for God should be given up. Isn't this a conflict?" The teaching of Lenin is a deep study, much deeper than most people realize. Is the communist an enemy of religion? Freedom of religion also implies freedom of non-religious belief. Our churches here are free, and our churches are open. Does not the state own and control the churches? The people own and control them. We are the people. This kind of circular discussion went on and on. I could not break through the official opinion. I was frequently referred to the abbot, but he was out of town, and that got us nowhere. Apparently the monks wanted nothing more than to convince me and my interpreter that the government was a friend of the church and a supporter of the faith. I might feel they had a different set of opinions and a different life behind their propagandism. But how right was I? Furthermore, was I not continually comparing religion in the USSR with religion in the USA? It cannot be compared, I told myself. It need not be compared. After all I wanted was to find out whether belief in God is necessary in the life of a people. But whereas we in America have access to spiritual life and thought by way of hundreds of denominational periodicals, the Russian Church is confronted with a ban on the publication and distribution of religious literature. Eastern churchmen no doubt have things to say, but no printed medium is allowed them. The lines of communication, as far as freedom of the religious press is concerned, are definitely down. And a monk said, "For those who believe God is necessary, He is necessary. But in Russia, as in all countries, there are many who do not believe." One of the monks lingered after the others, and the interpreter had gone. His face was prison pale. He looked as if he had been struggling forever against an inner fear. He had offered no comment during our interview, and why he stayed now I did not know, for we had no common language in which we could communicate. He stood there, a bearded man of perhaps 45, looking at me with critical, quizzing eyes. He put his cowl over his head and said something which I could not understand. From his tone and his earnestness, he seemed to be thanking me for having come. I wondered what I could give him as a remembrance. The only thing I had was the inevitable Lincoln penny. A Lincoln penny or a ballpoint pen. Every Russian who has ever met an American has a ballpoint pen. Every one I met would probably have a shiny Lincoln penny. We Americans are such insatiable givers. He settled the question for me by extending his hand, and then covering my hand with both of his. There is something a person feels that needs no language, something universal. It asks for nothing, desires nothing, expects nothing. No political curtain, no sectarian wall, no ideological boundary. No lack of communication can confine it. Wherever it is found, God is found. It may be that it comes closer to a discovery of God than many things we know. What can you read in the eyes of a monk? How far should one let his imagination carry him? Would this man return to his cell, wondering how much he could have told me? Would he say, "We told the stranger the truth, but he does not believe us"? Or, "We gave him the impression we are free, but actually we are not"? There is a constraint upon us, and we must weigh everything we do and say. There is something here we would like to escape from, but we do not know how. We say we have faith, but we have not enough faith to free ourselves. Did he want to say that there is no hope for religion in Russia, and tell me perhaps that I was right in my feeling that religion is actually as dead as the Tsars, and the cross is no match for the hammer and sickle? Or did he want to remind me that he too often felt that faith was moving in the people as a subterranean force, rising nearer the surface day by day? It was dark as I walked through the cloistered corridor back to where my driver sat dozing at the wheel. He laughed wonderingly at the time I had consumed in the old monastery, where there was really nothing to be seen any more. It used to be a beautiful place before the days of Hitler. We climbed the gravelled hill and returned to the pleasant streets of Kiev, streets that seemed always gay, especially at night, with the many young people and the women selling bouquets on the street corners, and the neon lights and the cinema marquees, making it look almost like a city in America. My driver took me to the hotel, and I paid him. He handed back my tip with a warning smile, shaking his finger and pretending offense. He made me understand I was not to impress him with the mock generosity of the capitalist system. After all, he had only done his duty. A good feeling, he assured me, is better than a few extra rubles any day. Chapter 3. Faith is for the free. In Kharkov, a towering cupola caught my eye the moment I arrived at the Intourist Hotel. I was told it was the cathedral on the hill. No sooner had I checked in than I thought I would sally forth to visit it and also to catch the town's vibrations. Kharkov, third largest city in the Soviet Union, is sprawling and wide with open spaces where the Nazis bombed and bled the earth in search of Lebensraum. They held Kharkov enslaved for 2 years, fully expecting to stay forever. The cathedral on the hill is a brave and beckoning church. It stands as if it had been appointed to guard the canal and the city, the new city, and the old which is being rebuilt. It looks over the homes which can never be rebuilt, because the householders died there, shaking their fists against the skies. And now the church stood there like God mourning over his people. I went up to pay my respects, to go, as it were, to the house of God in a godless land. Lorena went with me for pictures. We drew near the door, the main door that ordinarily leads to the nave, and I saw an iron bar across the entrance, and an iron lock holding this bar in place, like a mailed fist. Above the door, a number of used boards had been roughly fixed, as if to cover the spot where an icon had been ripped off, and as we stood there, and as the people went by, I wondered what greater insult to religion, what grimmer reminder of religion's hopelessness, than a lock that showed. I went around to a side door, and lo and behold, it was open. Only it did not look like a church door. It looked more like a factory entrance, with a ramp and worn planks, of the kind that heavy carts move over, wearing grooves and splintering the wood. It was quite dark inside the doorway, though it was mid-afternoon. The narrow, boarded-up walls forming a corridor were damp and dingy, almost like the catacombs. A man came toward me, asked sharply where I was going, then passed by without waiting for an answer. I had no answer anyway. I was going to church. I was visiting the brave cathedral, whose head is held high above the city. When I got to the foyer, I heard machinery, like factory machinery, faintly pounding a rhythmic tattoo that echoed upon the walls and spun a crazy chanting sound overhead. It was dark, but in a moment a door swung open, an inside door, and a heavy pushcart rolled out, guided by a workman. The cart was piled high with heavy boxes, and behind this scene, in the nave of the cathedral from which the workmen had come, were other boxes and cartons and barrels and supplies, stored against the icons and the pillars, while workmen moved them into place or out of place, as though the surroundings had never been a church at all. Several men had caught sight of me, and by the time the cart had moved away, they had gathered around me, demanding to know what I was doing in the factory, where I had come from, what I meant by walking in, and whether no one had stopped me at the door. All the while the litany of the machines rattled on, and when a workman opened a side door, I caught sight of rows of sewing machines, with their operators bent intently over them. All of this was taking place in what was once a transept, and further on, in what might have been the sacristy. Now I was being hurried out. It was not that the men did not want me to see how a cathedral can be adapted to a garment plant, or that I might not understand how, in the People's Republic, work is worship. I simply needed a permit, which was reasonable enough, and I was told if I was looking for a church, I would have no trouble finding one, for they assured me churches are open in Kharkov. So I walked out, away from the haunted voices of the machines and the sight of shipping boxes piled against the icons and images of saints. I started back to the hotel through a park which a man told me was really not a park but a memorial. Before the war, he explained, a large department store stood here. It was bombed by the Hitlerites. So many people were killed. It was decided to convert the area into a place where people can rest and reflect. You will see many memorials like this in Russia. Some will be even larger than this. Kharkov never really died. Cities like this do not die. And I looked up once more to the cathedral on the hill watching over the city. It is easy to romanticize American faith when you are in Russia. You think about our city churches and our country chapels and our people dressed in their Sunday best. Faith, you tell yourself, is for the free. You remember your own custom of church going and how the day was different and enriched because you had been to the services. Literally speaking, Russia does not have a Sabbath as far as communism is concerned. But while you are romanticizing, you also begin to wonder just what religion implies and what it is supposed to do. When you think about this, American religion runs through your mind, all the way from high-powered evangelism, which saves your soul, to positive thinking, which saves your reputation. When you have thought about all of that, you look around, you in a Russian city, like Kharkov, for example, and you meet the people and you find that here, where atheism is more than a term, where it is a way of life, people are courteous, hospitable, and kind, just as they are back home. You reach a conclusion something like this. In the light of Russia, we self-professed Christians ought to live out our faith more than we do. We should be more willing to demonstrate what we have in the way of a usable, workable, livable knowledge of God. Our faith should show up better than it does. And when you have finished with this sort of preaching, you look once more at the cathedral on the hill, and you have a feeling that it could never stand forgotten in the USA. You suddenly conclude with a feeling of joy and pride that, variegated as our religious pattern is, having in it everything from make-believe to miracles, it is the life stream of our nation. The world will never understand our generosity, believe our humanitarianism, or trust our motives until it grasps the simple nature of our faith. We are naive and childlike when it comes to religion, but it may be that because of this we often catch what we feel to be a fleeting glimpse of the kingdom of God. At any rate, we conclude, and no doubt rightly so, that we are what we are because of our tradition of faith. The workmen were right, of course, about open churches in Kharkov. I found 4 of them. One, the Cathedral of the Assumption, 3 blocks from the hotel, would inspire worship in anyone, whether or not he agreed with Russian Orthodoxy, or even if he professed no formal faith at all. It was a large, magnificent place of alternating maroon and yellow bricks, giving the great domed structure, a kind of tapestried effect. The dome and four cupolas were dwarfed by a bell tower, which rose like a rocket, bearing majestically toward the sky its huge golden cross. An iron fence surrounded the triangular plot where the cathedral stood. I had an appointment here one morning with one of the three priests, and my interpreter was to meet me outside the doors. I got there early and went inside. The towering walls and pillars were arrestingly beautiful. The icons covering them were works of art, traditional scenes from the life of Christ, portrayals of prophetic portions of Scripture, pictures of Russian patriarchs covered the arcs and adorned the interior of the dome. The altars were alabaster white, and above the sacred doors leading to the inner sacristy was a breathtaking painting of the Last Supper. Throughout the cathedral, the beauty was so symphonic and rich, one would have expected that here, more than in many another church, one would surely find the Russian proletariat. Yet I found only a small group of peasants, elderly women who came and went, buying a taper or a sacred wafer at the counter in the front transept, and getting their souls in order without benefit of a priest. They were gentle, patient worshippers, very devout. Their faces showed much suffering and hardship, but as they stood motionless in thoughtful worship, making the sign of the cross, they apparently found something in these lavish surroundings that was precious and sustaining for their lives. There was an old lady in black seated at a table in the dark of the transept near the door. She was an ageless nun laboriously writing in a book. Whenever I passed her in the shadows, I glanced at her because she herself looked almost like an icon. The touch of white beneath her black bonnet was a halo, and her round, red face was as peaceful as a saint's. She scanned the pages of her book half over her glasses, and whatever she was writing must have been important, for she would write a while, read it slowly, then dip her long pen into the inkwell and write some more. Once, when I passed her, she looked up. Her eyes met mine, and I tried to phrase a question to inquire what she was writing. She peered at me over her spectacles. Her face lighted with a smile, and before I could speak, she said, with warmth and feeling, "Slava Bogu." That was the first time anyone in Russia had said, "Praise the Lord," to me, and the way it was said did more for me than all my morning prayers and all my morning thoughts, and made me feel a good deal better about the communists who had taken over the temple on the hill. Here, at least, people were free to say, "Praise the Lord." The smile accompanying the words, the twinkle in the old woman's eyes, seemed to say, even a stranger must know the meaning of Slava Bogu. She dipped her pen into the ink well, touched the pen holder to her lips, and resumed her writing. I felt as if I had glimpsed into the inner heart of a Russian worshipper, and not one worshipper only, but perhaps the hearts of many, to whom the age-old greeting of Slava Bogu still had meaning, did it lie so closely beneath the Russian consciousness that it needed only an understanding glance to call it forth? Was religion, day by day, really rising like the priest's subterranean stream? Could it be that people here in the USSR actually loved God and held him more precious than anyone realized? Did acquiescence to the state keep them from the services, and was submission to atheistic ideology only a matter of expediency? Were people seeking God without even the church realizing it, or the government knowing about it, or a man's own neighbor being aware of it? In Stalin's day, everyone spied upon everyone else, and people learned to live their real lives in the dark. Could it be that they were still being elusive and non-committal about religion even now? Such thoughts were, of course, mere speculations, and when I stopped to analyze them, all I could conclude was that they had been inspired by an old woman with a saintly face, writing in a book, who did nothing more than greet me with Slava Bogu. I went outside and found my interpreter waiting. She was in her mid-20s, and there was no need to ask whether she even attended religious services. I was sure she did not, but I asked her just the same, and she said no. From the start, I knew that she would be one of my very best interpreters. Not only an outstanding linguist, she also had a tremendous feeling and concern for people, like all Russians of her generation, at least all whom I had met. She was an advocate of the socialistic point of view, and believed that her country had made its greatest strides since the advent of communism. She was an attractive, dark-haired, dark-eyed girl in a neatly tailored dress, which showed considerably more style than any I had noticed in shop windows. The dress was as modest as its wearer, and there was no pretense about her. She wore makeup sparingly, had beautifully manicured hands, and even her shoes, open-toed, were far better than any I had seen for sale in Russian stores. Most of all, she gave the impression of being a resourceful, strong-charactered person with considerable poise and capability. Her given name was Vera. She managed a small gift counter in the hotel and helped out as interpreter and guide for in-tourist whenever needed. At the present time, several tourist groups were in town, Czechs and East Germans, so she had been assigned to me. She was interested, she said, because my field was religion, and that was something she knew very little about. "What do you want to ask the priest?" she inquired. I explained that I was interested in finding out about the state of religion, whether the church was gaining or losing ground, what people believed, and whether Russia was actually as atheistic as its leaders claimed, or could ever become as atheistic as its leaders wanted it to be. "We can ask the priest all these things," she answered confidently. "We can ask him any questions you like. I am sure he will be glad to tell you." "Have you ever met him?" "Oh no, I have never even been inside the church." "Lived here all your life?" I reminded her. with a laugh, and never been inside the cathedral, not even to see what it looks like. You've been here only a few days, but you've seen more than I, she replied. Haven't you ever wanted to go into a church out of sheer curiosity? She was surprised at my question. Why should I have curiosity? So I can tell tourists what it is like? That might be one good reason. Few tourists ask to go to church, she said. I inquired about her parents, whether they belonged to a church. She told me her father and 2 brothers were war casualties. Her brothers were killed defending Kharkov. Her father died as a result of the war. No, they had not belonged to a church. As for Mother, she said reflectively, Mother used to go to church. I remember when I was a schoolgirl, she used to go to the service. Did she never ask you to go with her? No. Now let me think. No, she didn't. You see, she knew that I was getting the necessary training in school. What kind of training? In how to live. Moral training, I suppose you'd call it. I do remember that Mother used to pray. I remember how she made the sign of the cross. I always thought that was quite interesting, though I never really understood it. She doesn't belong to church now, or go to church anymore. No, all of this was years ago, before the war. Before the war. Did the war dissuade your mother from going to church? What do you mean? Did the war destroy your mother's faith in God? I really don't know. You see, when you say God and ask about God, I really do not know what you mean. The war destroyed many things. I suppose it could destroy what you call faith too. But as for Mother, she just gradually stopped saying her prayers and making the sign of the cross. She has not done any of that for years. If she had any reason for stopping, I do not know about it. We do not discuss such things. But tell me, do you ever have a consciousness of God? Do you ever have an insight or feeling or sense of identity with God? Or if the term God is unacceptable, let's say a sense of something or someone unseen, a presence. I really never analyze things that way or think in such terms. Should I? Well, people have been thinking about such things for some time. She laughed quietly. Am I so different from anyone else? I don't think so. Some people feel the need for religion, others do not. I do not. I have no religious curiosity. Maybe I should have. Do you think I should? Well, I said, if you did have, you might be able to tell an inquiring tourist about it. But I haven't. So, shall we go in and see what the priest has to say? I often thought I would like to take a Russian visitor into one of our American churches, but what more novel experience could I ask than to take a Russian into her own church for the first time? We went inside. For a moment, the full beauty of the setting caught my companion off guard. Her eyes swept over the scene, fell for an instant upon the group of women gathered in front of an altar, and then rested upon the priest, just entering the sacred doors, with slow, contemplative steps. He was a tall, graying man, clean-shaven, a benign, gentle-faced man whose alert eyes spied us with something of a flash. He approached, with slightly bowed head, absently fingering the gold cross dangling against his long brown robe. There was nothing posed about him. In fact, he appeared to be a rather sad man, whose office had endowed him with patience. A woman nearby hurried forward when she saw him. He tried to restrain her, but she took his hand in both of hers, bent low, kissed his hand, and then, when he touched her head, she remained standing there, weeping for sheer joy, it seemed to me, at having had so great a privilege. Several other worshippers surged forward, but the priest lifted a hand, and they waited. Then he came to where we stood. Vera introduced herself and me, explaining why I had come, and where I had come from. He welcomed us graciously and said 2 other priests would join us in a moment. Then he asked us to follow him. We walked past the old woman who was writing and who did not look up, past the pillars and the icons until we came to a dais where a layman arranged chairs and brought in a small writing table. Here we sat with a view of the nave and the worshippers, though we were far enough removed to be quite alone. The morning light sparkled through the colored finger-like windows. The icons glistened. A bearded priest, swinging a silver censer on a chain, moved through the church, spreading a mist of thin smoke over the scene. The musical clank of the censer echoed in the church. The smell of incense drifted over to us. Vera smiled as if to admit there was a certain enchantment here, but I suspected she felt it was not necessarily a desirable enchantment. It was rather a certain magic, which should not be trusted too far. Things of this kind, she may have been thinking, play upon the emotions, upon one's sentimentality. There is a certain theatricalism about them, so let us not trust them too far. Then she said, "So, shall we begin our interview?" 2 other priests joined us. They were men in their mid-40s, very interested and courteous throughout a meeting, which continued for more than an hour, a meeting which can be summed up with one conclusive opinion. The clergy of the Russian Orthodox Church are not prepared to say one word against the government. They may be speaking either from the basis of facts or fear. I could not tell which. Perhaps they have no grievances against the government, or perhaps they feel themselves in complete subjection to the party bosses. It may be they fear the power the Kremlin wields. Whatever it is, the impression given was the same I had found everywhere along my trip. The churches are open. The future of religion is up to the people. A question: is your church completely free, or is it subject to domination by the Communist Party? Was answered. We are of course entirely free. We have been free ever since the Soviet order was established. Are you free to propagate the faith? Why shouldn't we be? No one hinders us. Haven't restrictions been placed on the church and on your educational system and on your entire program? There have been changes, of course, but we need not view changes as restrictions. Weren't there many persecutions of church leaders after the revolution, and are there not likely to be persecutions again if the church does not follow the restrictions the state has placed upon you? There have been instances of arrest among religious leaders, but these were not the result of religious infractions. Some were found guilty of being enemies of the Soviet order. That is another matter. The decree of 1918 forms the basis for church and state relationship. Didn't the church object to this decree and resist it? That history is long and involved, said one of the priests with a sigh. I thought about the statement and the way it was said after our interview was over, and long after Vera had casually shrugged off any new knowledge of religion merely as part of general knowledge. Surely, she contended, there is nothing mysterious or miraculous about religion. It can all be explained as man's struggle against man. Why bring the gods into it? Such an approach, she observed, could only confuse the picture and blind us to reality. She was, of course, thinking in terms of Russian religion, just as my guide had in Kiev, but it was exactly this, the historical reality of religion in Russia, which could give us our best understanding both of contemporary Russian faith and the communist attitude. The early Russians whom Vladimir forced to become Christians back in the 10th century never actually gave up their pagan practices. They never became Christians in the Western Protestant sense of the term. The church knew it, and the priest knew it. They knew that in the mind of the peasant, Christianity was an attempted substitute for pagan worship. Priests took the places of the gods. Icons were substituted for charms. Sacraments replaced the fetishes. And when the people were called upon to give and suffer for the propagation of the faith, it was just another form of sacrifice of the kind once demanded by Svarog and Parum. Religion was nationalized from the time of Vladimir up to the very hour of the 1917 revolution. There was no separating church and state, just as there was no separating paganism from Christianity. The church taught respect for the emperor or czar, despite his often dubious character. It insisted that poverty and ignorance were part of the divine order, and the main function of the church was to perpetuate itself regardless of the concessions it might have to make. Compared with Roman Catholicism, Russian Orthodoxy produced few great philosophers, and even fewer saints. It had neither the theological depths nor the dogmatic wisdom of the Western Church, but neither did it have a Reformation. It was never confronted by a Luther or a Calvin, a Zwingli or a Knox. It was born of opportunity and nurtured on compromise, and no one ever had the courage to nail a thesis to its door. But it had one insistently stubborn conviction. It believed itself to be the true Church of Christ, and imagined itself divinely protected against any force, from within or without. It concluded that God miraculously protected it against the abortive revolution of 1905. It closed its ears to cries for reform. It ridiculed the intrusion of Marxist doctrines, which crept into Russia as part of the process of westernization. Throughout the pre-revolutionary period, there were struggles for power between the Orthodox hierarchy and schismatic religious groups. The church was dissolute and divided, and ridiculed the possibility of a Bolshevik coup d'etat. It boasted of being the true Church of Christ, and clung to this belief even when it awoke in 1917 and found the godless Bolsheviki in power. The gap between the church and the czars, which was arrogant, secularistic, and superstitious, and the Russian church of today, confused, defensive, and captive, is a wide gap. Priests I interviewed always gave me the impression that they were secretly and hopefully waiting for a prophetic voice and a powerful hand to lead them out of the confusion and disillusionment of 1,000 years. This was also the feeling I had about Protestantism in Russia. In Tourist had graciously arranged a hotel room meeting for me with an evangelical Baptist pastor in Kharkov. The Baptist came to Russia nearly 100 years ago when a Russian was converted to the Baptist faith in Germany and returned to his homeland as a missionary. This was contrary to the laws at the time, which forbade proselytizing. He carried on his work underground, however supported by Baptist groups in England and America. The Kharkov pastor was a tall, lean, middle-aged man, unpretentious and unclerical, in a brown business suit. He was all for talking religion and eager to tell me about his congregation of nearly 1,000 souls who were just now remodeling their church and looking forward to continuing growth in membership. The growth was slow, to be sure, and religion could not be measured by the kind of enthusiasm we enjoyed in the United States. But he was optimistic about the future. The church, he said, is on its own, and what it will do depends upon the church. Vera, who was again my interpreter during this hotel interview, asked me if that made sense. I said it did, and she said I'm glad, for evidently the statement had no meaning for her. She rarely commented on anything that was said in these interviews, and never editorialized, nor even when the minister, in speaking of Christian virtues, suddenly said, "No one who smokes can possibly belong to my church." I told him this was not the case in most churches in America. "Ah," he exclaimed, I know, but it should be." I said I was surprised to hear him emphasize this rather than such issues as the position of the church in the world, its attitude on war, its importance as an instrument of world brotherhood. "Those things are vital, of course," he declared, "but the individual must first give evidence of his faith by living the Christian life." But I had to say, the moral life which you stress is one which communism also stresses, apart from any religious or Christian emphasis. Don't you think people can be morally good outside of the church? "They can," he replied. "The state wants its young people, all of its people, to be good people. Of course, this is true. So, we can work together on this, can't we?" Can you work together in other fields? Are there no ideological conflicts between your church and the state? "We are entirely free," he said. I again received the stock answers to all my questions. The church is open. The people are free to worship. There is no conflict between religion and the state. He came back to his moral emphasis at every opportunity, going so far as to say that the Bible specifically forbids smoking. I did not ask him to put his hands on the text that proved it. "Here is my interpreter," I said. "She doesn't smoke. She is a highly moral person. She represents a generation that has never been inside a church, yet she impresses me as being fully as moral as young people who go to church. I have no doubt, he agreed. Russian young people are very good, to which he added, and it is good that they are. So what is the purpose of the church? What is its function? There is the matter of salvation, he said, after a moment. You mean that people who do not belong to church will not be saved, that is, go to heaven? He gave the question thought and said, No one knows what God does in these matters, or how God judges people, but there is a special duty upon us who believe in salvation through the church and the Word. There is a duty upon us to be loyal to His church, and loyal to the state, even if that state is anti-church. The state is not anti-church. The church is free and separated from the state. The Scripture tells us to give to Caesar that which is Caesar's. He returned to the subject of morals and asked me to tell him a bit more about religion and morals in the United States, which I did. This was neither easy nor simple, especially since my listener shook his head continually and murmured audibly about the fantastic state of religion in the USA. He summed it up as crime waves, but great interest in religion, juvenile delinquency, but the Sunday schools are crowded, racism, but much talk of Christ love, air bases around the world, but big missionary programs, world philanthropy, but money-mad materialism. It was beyond him, but nevertheless he had to confess he liked Americans, even though he never expected to understand them. Then he told us that this was choir rehearsal evening at his church, and invited us to attend. Vera said she would be able to go. It would be her first opportunity to visit a Protestant church, and she seemed rather eager for the experience. Lorena and I arranged to meet her there at 8 o'clock. The church was within easy walking distance of the hotel, on a side street, inconspicuously and unpretentiously tucked away in a neighborhood of friendly homes. To reach it, we finally had to go through a graveled alleyway, where children, together with a couple of dogs, played in the dusk. People sat in the backyards, and a radio blared out Russian music through an open door. When we met Vera in front of the white wooden church, I asked her which appealed more to her, the cathedral or this plain, typical, old Protestant structure. She said I would first have to be convinced of the appeal of religion. Do you think anyone could convince you of that? I don't think anyone could, she replied. The minister came out to welcome us, taking note of Lorena's cameras and flash equipment through the top of his bifocals as we approached. He explained that the choir had been rehearsing for nearly an hour, not for our coming, but because they loved to sing. The choir consisted of more than 80 voices, but since the people were laborers and some worked on night shifts, there were only some 50 in attendance this evening. He led us inside, under pieces of scaffolding, where repairs were being made, and paused with justifiable pride to let us look at the interior from beneath the balcony. The auditorium was small, seating perhaps 300, very plain and simply furnished, a kind of country church that one would find everywhere in our Midwest. On the white plastered walls were scripture texts, proclaiming in Russian that God so loved the world, and I am the light of the world, and behold the Lamb of God. There were, of course, no pictures and no icons. The floor was plain boards. The wooden pews looked homemade, and on the chancel was a sturdy pulpit with an open Bible, but one had the feeling that everything here was exceedingly precious. The flowers on the pulpit, the hymn boards, the upright piano in front of the chancel were all important, and seemed to say that the little church was greatly loved. The minister escorted us to the choir loft, which was actually a series of raised planks against the left wall of the church. The members rose to their feet. When we approached, the director, a young appearing man, stood at a lectern, baton in hand. We were introduced to him and then to the choir. They greeted us as if we were their honored guest. The feeling of friendship was spontaneous and genuine. They wanted us to know we had done them a single favor by coming. Most of them, there were perhaps a dozen teenagers in the group, had met only 2 Americans in all their lives, Protestant ministers traveling under the auspices of denominational boards. Everyone shook hands with us and had an enthusiastic, often excited word of greeting. Some covered my hands with both of theirs, and let me know by expressions and words what they thought of America. To them America was a great nation, our people a great people, our churches great churches. America is our Christian neighbor, they said. Our Christian faith knows no barriers. Our Christ knows no hatred, has no suspicions, makes no distinction between people who believe in him, no matter where they live. Our interpreter was almost as thrilled as we at this royal welcome. She seemed to be saying, "Do you see how friendly Russians are? This is the motherland. These are the people, and the people are the state." The choir sang its first number, a stirring hymn about the majesty of God. The blending of voices was magnificent, and the spirit of the singing swept away all barriers and differences in language or ideas. It sounded like a Cossack chorus. Lorena, who had permission to take pictures, momentarily forgot about her cameras and stood listening. The numbers were startling and magnificent, but nothing we could have said or felt paid the event a better tribute than Vera's sudden yet quietly controlled question, "Do people sing so beautifully in American churches?" She said no more than that, but as the hymns continued, each seemingly richer and more beautiful than the preceding, she sat lost in thought, often as visibly startled as we at the glory of the singing. How, I wondered, could religion fail to inspire people where it had this kind of self-expression? What could hold it back? This was like a return to Petrskaya Chapel. Once more it was the soul of the Russian people, assuring us that the God who is praised is the God who is loved. Just now you wanted to say to the millions of Russians who had left the churches, "Come back and listen. 1 hour here, strengthened by faith, is better than your continual attempt to prove or disprove God." After an hour in which the hymnody of Russian Protestantism seemed to ignite the faith anew in all of us who believed, I realized that the back of the church was crowded with people. They were seated in the pews beneath the balcony and standing, often families together, in the aisles. They had come not to see the American visitors, but to listen to the choir and to see the faces of those who stood enraptured beneath the moving baton. You could close your eyes now and feel a spirit of worship. You could imagine yourself in any Protestant church anywhere in the world where people love to sing. You could make believe you were back in your own church at home. Only then you wished you could convey to American Protestants something of the loneliness you feel because there is such a gulf in understanding between the people of two worlds. Russia, I said to myself, is only some 18 hours away from America in terms of time, but we are 100 years apart in terms of understanding. We are so close we can communicate in minutes, and yet so far away we seem never to reach each other's thoughts. We are hopelessly apart, yet we need only extend our hands to the people and we are one. You cannot listen to Russian music, Christian music, without wishing you had the secret for creating better relations between the USA and the USSR. If we could only meet the masses, if we could only persuade them, we have nothing to promote but friendship, nothing to bring but peace, nothing to sell, and nothing to gain but the fellowship of understanding. What a great adventure it would be! But even as I was thinking in terms of religious adventures, one was being plotted for me at this very moment. I say it was an adventure because I am no singer, certainly not when compared with these Russians, who were making the church resound, and who were luring in the neighbors. It was natural, however, that at the conclusion of the rehearsal, one of the younger members should come up with a request, which Vera gaily interpreted. Would the visitors from America sing a song for them? My interpreter took it upon herself to intrude, for the first time, with an opinion of her own. She was sure that anyone with a name like Bach should be quite capable of filling such a request. Her opinion was endorsed by a chorus of voices, inferring that it was surely the Lord's wish that I should turn church soloist. They did not include Lorena in this because she was busily changing films. At such times, she has a happy facility of being preoccupied with her cameras. I tried to ease out of it without offense to the Lord or to Russia by saying that it was too bad no one had a violin, because I would not mind playing a number. But even then I had a sinking feeling someone might rush out and hunt up a fiddle. I asked Vera to explain that years ago I used to play in church orchestras and knew all the songs from Revive Us Again to A Mighty Fortress, but I urged her to emphasize that that was years ago. Tell them, I said, that though I memorized the melodies, I did not know the words. It was a lame excuse. I knew it was. Vera translated. They say that they are not looking for musical perfection. They say they are not perfectionists either. They say they just want to hear a religious hymn, the kind sung in your home church. I promised myself then and there that when I got back home, I would begin learning the words to a dozen hymns right away. But that good intention did me no good here, and now in the Baptist Church of Kharkov I was on the spot, and I knew it. But suddenly I came up with an idea. I say suddenly, but actually it occurred to me only after I had taken an inventory of the songs for the entire liturgical year, realizing how many first lines I knew and how few first verses. I asked Vera to inquire whether they had Silent Night in their repertory, and they did, and I said it would be a wonderful idea for all of us to sing it together, they in Russian and I in English. This was agreed to wholeheartedly, with the proviso that I first sing one verse solo, which I did, and the Russian people gathered that evening in the Baptist Church of Kharkov were the best audience, and the only one I have ever had as a vocalist. And when I finished, I was convinced of something else. Silent Night is effective no matter who sings it. Then we sang it together. More correctly, I stood in the choir loft with them, while all around me people everywhere in Christendom seemed to be singing. After the song was finished, a hush fell over the church, a silence so deep that the director laid his baton on the lectern with both hands so that it would make no sound. A large, husky man at my side turned to me with tears in his eyes, took my hand and said, "Slava Bogu." The choir members turned to one another without speaking. They merely glanced at each other for a moment, or turned a hymnal over in their hands, or put the book down on a chair silently, or touched their hands to their eyes and then turned away. As I started back to the pew, they took my hand, and one by one they said, "Mir, mir," which is peace, peace, and "Do svidaniya," which is a good farewell, or "Spasibo," which is more than just thank you, but most of them said, "Slava Bogu." It was late when Lorena and I walked back to the hotel with our interpreter. The alley neighborhood was very quiet, and the streets were quite deserted. A few women, attired in overalls, worked by lantern light, doing men's work in a ditch near the curb. Munching a piece of black bread, a very old man looked up at us and smiled. A group of workmen passed us. A street car rattled by. As we crossed the street at an open corner, I saw the tower of the old cathedral on the hill against the moonlit sky. I wondered whether it might have heard the voices singing Silent Night, or was it much too lonely and too old to hear? We hardly spoke all the way back to the hotel. There was not a great deal to say, but when we parted at the hotel and an in-tourist car came to take Vera home, Lorena said good night to her, and I said Slava Bogu. Is that better for a greeting or for saying goodbye? Either way, she said. Tonight it is rather good. Either way.